Hello and welcome to another in my video tutorial series for human resource management. This video lecture is going to examine a variety of approaches to a very common concept that we need to make sure we master when it comes to human resource management, and that's performance management. Performance management is simply the process through which managers are going to ensure that employees' activities and their outputs are going to contribute to our overall organizational goals. So there are a lot of factors that fall into understanding performance management, so let's jump right on in. Now, although many employees dread the annual performance appraisal meeting at which a boss is going to pick apart the employee's behavior from the past year, now performance management can potentially deliver many benefits, both to the individual employee as well as to the organization as a whole. Effective performance management can tell top performers, hey, you're valued with our organization. We appreciate you. You're doing great. It can also encourage communication between managers and their subordinate employees. Another thing that performance management can do is it can establish consistent standards for evaluating our employees within our organization and help the organization identify its strongest and its weakest employees. To meet these objectives, companies must think of effective performance management as a process that's part of our organization, not just an event that occurs once a year. Let's take a look at this overall process of performance management. What all goes into it? Well, with the first step here, we're identifying what the organization is trying to accomplish. What are our goals? What are our objectives? And as a manager, you should definitely know these things. Step two, we're going to develop employee goals and actions to achieve those outcomes. If the goals and actions that we are developing for employees aren't meeting our company or our organizational goals and objectives, then we're not doing it right. The third step in our performance management process is we're going to provide employees with training and necessary resources and tools, as well as some ongoing feedback between the employee and the manager. This should not be a once-a-year process. We should have ongoing feedback between us and our subordinates. That is where most organizations fail. Now, step four in our performance management process is when we are going to decide, how often we're going to decide to evaluate the employee performance. If we do this regularly, it's going to be more valuable to the employee, and it's a way for us to measure, are we doing everything we need at the right time and providing the employee everything they need to meet our organizational goals. Step five, here's where both the employee and the manager are identifying what the employee can do to capitalize on their performance strengths, as well as to address any weaknesses that we've identified. Lastly, step six, here we're providing consequences for failing to achieve performance outcomes, as well as providing some reward or feedback if they are achieving their outcomes. Organizations establish performance management systems to meet three broad purposes that I've got listed here: strategic purpose, administrative purpose, and the developmental purpose. Now, the strategic purpose helps link employees' behaviors with our organizational goals. Performance management can achieve its strategic purpose only when measurements are truly linked to the organizational goals and when the goals and the feedback about performance are obviously communicated to our employees. Communication is not just important from the top down to the administrative managers or the level one managers. Communication is only effective if it's throughout our whole organization, and that includes feedback and goal creation with our employees. They need to know what's expected and how to achieve those goals. There's also the administrative purpose. Performance management can support decision-making related to things like employee retention, termination of employee for poor behavior, and hiring or even layoffs. Information in a performance appraisal can have a great impact on the future of some of our individual employees. And now we have the developmental purpose. Even employees who are meeting expectations can always become more valuable when they hear and they discuss their performance feedback. Effective performance feedback makes employees aware of their strengths and of the areas in which they can improve. This kind of goes along with total quality management, or TQM. While we may be doing things great now, we want to make sure we continue to find ways to improve and perform better. We can do that with our performance management. Selecting performance measures is a critical part of planning a performance management system, and there are 5 criteria that are going to determine the effectiveness of the performance measures. Does it fit with strategy? A performance management system should aim at achieving employee behavior and attitudes that are going to support the organization's strategy, its goals, and of course our organizational culture. Validity refers to whether the appraisal measures all the relevant aspects of performance and it omits irrelevant aspects of performance. Reliability describes the consistency of the results that the performance measure will deliver. Acceptability, whether or not a measure is valid and reliable, it must meet the practical standard of being acceptable to the people who are going to use the performance management system. And the 5th criteria is that of specific feedback. A performance measure should specifically tell an employee what's expected of them and how they can meet those expectations. Now, being specific helps performance management meet the goals of supporting strategy and developing employees. If a measure does not specify what an employee must do to help the organization achieve its goals, it does not support the strategy. If the measure fails to point out employees' performance problems, they will not know how to improve to do better and to meet the strategy and the goals for our organization. There are different methods for measuring performance. First one I've got listed here is comparisons. Now this is going to include things like simple rankings, forced distribution method, and paired comparison method. You might be familiar with some of these, you might have experienced them, and there are some that you hopefully will never experience. But a simple ranking, this is the method of performance measurement that requires managers to rank employees in their group from who is their highest performer to who is their poorest performer. So who's my best, who's my worst? And I have to turn it in that way. There's also forced distribution method. In this method for measuring performance, it's a method of where we're going to assign a certain percentage of employees to each category in a set of categories. So we might have a group where we're saying, okay, we have level 5s, level 4s, level 3s, level 2s, and level 1s. And a certain percentage of employees are going to be in level 1, a certain percentage is going to be in level 5, and within those levels, we're going to rate our employees from best to worst. That is a scary category or a scary type of distribution method to be in. You might get put into a level that you're the only one that's in that level, and other people are at a higher level, and they may within the organization, so you might get ranked low because you don't have the ability and you're not being held accountable for the same type of criteria in that grouping. It's a scary one to be in. And some companies set up some rules, like if you fall within your level, if you are rated at a low performance for X amount of years, let's say, then you can be terminated. So if you are forced into a group that is definitely not the group you should be in, which is, shame on the organization for doing that, but you could be forced out of the organization because of the rules for something that's completely out of your way. You could be a top performer, be put in a group you shouldn't be, and fall prey to low ranking. And the last method I wanted to talk about is the paired comparison method. That's a mouthful. Paired comparison method. This is just a method of performance measurement that compares each employee with each other employee to establish the rankings. Let's compare apples to apples. So there's a couple of ways that are good here. One is not so good. but it's up to your organization to determine which one they're going to use. Another area we want to talk about is that of ratings. There are lots of methods to rate attributes and behaviors. These can include like graphic rating scales and mixed standard scales. Now, graphic rating scales, these are going to list the traits that provide a rating scale for each trait. Employers are going to use the scale to indicate to an extent to which employee displays each trait. We may also see here that these rating scales are going to be subjective and they can vary by employer. So that one's a little worrisome too because it is so subjective. Now, one way that we can overcome drawbacks of rating attributes is to measure employees' behavior. To rate behaviors, an organization is going to begin by defining which behaviors are going to be associated with the success for that job. Which kinds of behaviors are going to help the organization achieve its goals. The appraisal is going to ask the manager to rate an employee in terms of each of the identifiable behaviors. Now, some of the techniques that are used are going to include one that you might have heard of before or maybe you have even been part of, and that's BARS. This is the behaviorally anchored rating scale. There's also the critical incident method. There's the behavioral observation scale, or BOSS. Another one is organizational behavior modification. Now, the critical incident method is a method of performance measurement based on the manager's records of specific examples of the employees acting in ways that are either effective or ineffective. Here we have some documented proof. Now, BARS, or the behaviorally anchored rating scale, is a method of performance measurement that rates behaviors in terms of a scale showing very specific statements of behavior that describe different levels of performance to that behavior. I'll give you an example of that here shortly. I mentioned behavioral observation scale, BOSS. This is a variation of BARS which uses all behaviors necessary for effective performance to rate performance at a task. And lastly, I talked about organizational behavior modification. This is a plan for managing the behavior of employees through a very formal system of feedback and then reinforcement. That might sound familiar to you if you've ever had some psychology courses. Here's an example of BARS. Just wanted you to give this as an example. So we see that here's the job role of a nurse. And the performance dimension that we're looking at is dealing with difficult patients. Now we have a rating scale here, 1 to 5. 1 being that they are impatient with difficult patients and they regularly need other people to help deal with those patients. So that's not a very good nurse. Whereas on the other end with the 5, we see that they're never impatient with difficult patients. They're showing sympathy in their actions with those patients as well as their families, and they go out of their way to help other nurses with difficult patients, and lastly, easing patient fears. That's what we see as the gold standard. That's really what we expect. But if we see that they're not quite to a 5, we're going to evaluate based off that individual and this criteria where they rank. Another example could be like where we see a teamwork dimension, and we say on a 5-point scale that person makes, inappropriate or rude comments. Where on the other end of the scale, we have like a level 5, and we would have some other levels in between, but we might say that level 5 criteria could be that they're encouraging and facilitating moderation of conflict. So based off their teamwork dimension, how do they fit in that teamwork role? And we would rate them on that. We would have lots of other criteria too. So BARS rating scale, or BARS anchored rating scale, there's where we get the BARS. This can be very helpful, and a lot of organizations do their performance management that way. Next I want to talk about was measuring results. One term that is very popular is management by objective. Now, this is a system in which people at each level of the organization are going to set goals in a process that flows from the top down to the bottom. And this is so that employees at all levels are contributing to the organization's overall goals. These goals become the standards for evaluating every employee's performance. So your manager is going to be given goals from the manager above them and maybe the manager above them. And what you are going to be expected to do and how you're going to be measured is going to affect your manager's performance, which is going to affect the next manager's performance. And an MBO system, or management by objective system, it's going to have three components really. So your goals need to be very specific. They need to be a little difficult to achieve, but they must be achievable, and they have to meet the objectives. So managers and their employees work together in this system to be able to set those goals. Another thing is that the manager is going to give objective feedback through the rating period to monitor the progress towards those goals. So it's not going to be a one-time thing. It's not going to be every July we got to sit down and do this. We're going to have feedback that's given periodically. Now, management by objective can have a very positive effect on an organization's performance, since it's all tied to the organizational objectives, and everyone within the hierarchy is defined on how to meet those objectives. Everyone's contributing. That's how the organizational performance can be positively affected. Another method for measuring performance, this last method is called TQM, or Total Quality Management, and I alluded to this earlier. It's just an assessment of both individual performance and the system within an individual works. It's going to yield subjective feedback from managers, from peers, and customers about the employee's personal qualities such as cooperation and initiative. It's also going to yield objective feedback based on their work process, what kind of, they obtained a variety of methods like statistical quality control, so we can pull statistical data from, how has their attendance been, a lot of different things we can measure. Have there been a lot or a small amount of defects or issues? So we're going to get that objective feedback besides the subjective feedback. Like I said, total quality management never stops. We're never happy. We're always continuously moving to get better. There can be errors in performance management. Several kinds of errors and biases commonly influence performance measurements in a lot of organizations. People often tend to give a higher evaluation to people that they consider are very similar to themselves. Most people simply think of themselves as being effective. So if somebody else is like them, well, they must be effective too. And it's sometimes wrong, and when similarity is based on characteristics such as things like race or sex, these type of decisions are absolutely discriminatory. We have to continuously train managers to avoid being discriminatory based off of individual characteristics. I've also got listed contrast errors. With contrast errors, the rater compares individuals not against objective standards, but against other employees. Well, you're just not as good as Billy Bob, so I'm going to rank you lower. Why is that person lower? Is there something specific? With distributional error, the rater uses only part of the rating scale. Like they may show leniency, where the reviewer rates everyone near the top. Or they could be one of those reviewers that is a strict reviewer, so they might favor lower rankings for everybody. Or we could even see a central tendency where the reviewer simply rates everyone in the middle of the scale, so they're not showing that everybody's great or everybody's bad. With rater bias, this lets the rater is going to have their opinion of one quality, and it's going to color the opinion of others. Some examples of this would be like the halo error. Now, this bias causes favorable ratings because the rater simply thinks one good thing about that person makes them good. Everything about them is absolutely good. So a lot of times what they base this on is some recent interaction that they had with them that they can remember very easily. There's also the Horns error. This bias causes negative ratings. So the opposite of the halo error, the rater is going to think one bad thing about them simply means everything about them is bad. These biases are definitely not what we want to happen during performance management. Now, there are ways that we can reduce errors. Raters can be trained to avoid making errors using a variety of methods. One method we could do is where they're going to rate fictional employees and then discuss the decisions. Or maybe we can have them study actual examples of various performances. That way we make them consistent and we help them identify and avoid any type of biases or discriminations or any other kind of errors that can pop up during performance management. When it comes to giving performance feedback should be a regular, scheduled management activity, not just a once-a-year type activity that they are forced to do. And this is so that employees can correct problems as soon as they occur. Managers and employees should be well prepared for each formal feedback session. During this session, managers can take any of 3 approaches. You could have heard of one of these. I bet you've probably been part of one of these approaches. So we have the tell and sell approach, which is where a manager tells the employees their ratings and then keeps telling them to sell their ratings by justifying them. There's also the tell and listen approach. Here, the manager is going to tell employees their ratings and then let employees explain their own views. So this is the tell and listen. I'm going to tell you how I'm rating you. Now I'm going to sit back and I'm going to listen as you explain your view based off of each of these. And then lastly, we have the problem-solving approach. Here, managers and the employee are going to work together to solve any type of performance problems that are identified. Employees with high ability and high motivation, well, they are generally very solid employees and performers in our organization. But while this may not be a surprise, or it could be, not everyone is a solid performer in every organization. The final feedback stage of performance management involves identifying areas for improvement and ways to improve performance in those areas. When performance evaluation indicates that an employee's performance is below standard, the feedback process should launch an effort to help correct the problem. Even when the employee is meeting current standards, the feedback session may identify areas in which the employee can improve in order to contribute more to the organization in a current or even possibly a future job. The type of action taken is going to depend on what your specific employee lacks. Maybe it's a lack of ability, so we can find ways to make their ability better. Perhaps it's a lack of motivation. Maybe we can take a look and see what we can help with their motivation. Maybe they lack both, or maybe they lack neither, but that's typically what we see. Now, of course, there are legal and ethical issues in performance management. In developing and using performance management systems, HR professionals need to ensure that these systems meet all legal requirements, such as the avoidance of any type of discrimination in performance management. In addition, performance management systems should meet ethical standards, such as with protecting employees' privacies. Everybody doesn't need to know how the performance management went with an employee. Word of mouth, the grapevine, that's going to work through, but we got to make sure that our system, our performance management system, protects employees' privacy. Really, lawsuits often arise in 2 areas when it comes to performance management. That's discrimination and unjust dismissal. To protect against both kinds of lawsuits, it's important to have a legally defensible performance management system. A system is more likely to be legally defensible if it is based on behaviors and results rather than on traits, and if multiple raters evaluate each person's performance. The reason I like that we have multiple raters is I'm a big fan of 360-degree performance evaluations, so that an employee is getting evaluated based off multiple people. And when we have that happen, and we have that as part of our performance management system, if there is a lawsuit about discrimination or unjust dismissal, and we have this documented with multiple raters, this is one way that we have a legally defensible system. We base it on behaviors and results, and we had multiple raters as part of this evaluative process. Computer technology now supports many performance management systems, but can generate some privacy concerns because of if it's on a machine and it's got an electrical current, it's got a network connection, it's hackable. Many companies use computers and sensors and mobile devices to monitor productivity and other performance measures electronically. We can tell how someone's rate is if they're on a line, what their part pick is, what their attendance is, how often are they tardy. We have a lot of ways of measuring performance electronically. This can improve productivity as people know that they're being measured, but again, it does raise some privacy concerns, such as with the use of employee badges. Electronic systems should not be a substitute for careful management. That is the job for the manager. Hopefully, you've realized that HR functions are more than just hiring and firing. Performance management is just one aspect of human resource management, and I hope that you will take it seriously and probably look back at how it's been done in the past to you, and hopefully when you get that chance to be that human resource professional, you understand what's needed and how to avoid bias and discrimination. Thank you for following along this video. I hope you found this information helpful and that it will start your journey in looking into more of the areas I talked about with performance management so that you become a better human resource professional.